Wheat is about to get super sexy. Now, wheat is normally a weed, and that's why most people don't like talking about it. Wheat farmers have been incredibly unloved for decades because just as dairy and beef have been separated from row crops, wheat has been pushed to the side. It's drought tolerant, it's cold tolerant, it's heat tolerant, it's flood tolerant. You grow it only in places where you cannot grow anything else. Even the Ukrainians are moving away from it because they have limited export options. And so the green here is row crop. The brown is wheat row crop specifically. And you'll notice it's not on the good land as a rule. Sorry, Kansas. But we can only grow it in those zones with industrial level inputs. Marginal land with industrial level inputs can grow wheat. Marginal land without those inputs cannot. And this pattern has happened the world over. About the only place that they still grow wheat on the good land, France, because croissants, and India and Pakistan for food security issues. That's it. Everyone else, it's on the edges. You break down the industrial input system, most of the brown goes away. Now again, in the United States and North America, I am not concerned because we produce what we need locally for those inputs. But for everyone else, wheat is the product that is going to suffer the greatest production declines, which means that wheat is the product that is most likely to experience the greatest price increases because it remains humanity's #1 source of calories. You can have wheat or you can die. All right, final slide. This is CPI, inflation in the United States and Canada, similar systems, heavily interlinked. You would expect the data to track, it does. We have 3 big phases of inflation since World War II. We first had that initial urbanization and industrialization push. We built the interstate highway system. We ran power into the countryside. We built the cities. Industrial demand-driven inflation. Then the baby boomers came of age. They bought their homes, they raised their kids. Consumer demand-driven inflation. And now we've been living in this weird-ass period. The Soviet system collapsed, and that dumped an empire worth of raw materials on the world, keeping the commodity prices under control. The Chinese brought 1 billion workers to the global workforce, and that pushed down the cost of manufactured goods. And these trends lasted for 30 years. Well, folks, the disinflationary trends are turning inflationary, and the inflationary trends are back. The Chinese system is going away. That's inflationary. The Russian stuff is going away. That's inflationary. We need to double the size of the industrial plant to make up for the loss of Germany and China. Wildly inflationary. And while the baby boomers may be retiring, their kids, the millennials, are now in their prime for consumption. We're looking at 9 to 15% inflation a year for at least the next 5. Now, before you have a stroke and call your broker, deep breath. This is a good story. We need to double the size of the industrial plant. We need to fully integrate Mexico. Mexico is a food importer. They're your #1 consumer. We are talking about the greatest growth story in Canadian, Mexican, and American history as we build out that industrial plant. And when we are done, not only will inflation go down, we will have a supply chain system that is domestic, that employs locals, that is cleaner, that uses less energy, and where the end product is produced where we live. This is the greatest economic story of our country's history. Or we could choose to not do it, and 5 years from now, not only do we not have stuff because China and Germany are gone, but we still have the inflation. Now, one of these is a great story, one of these is kind of crappy. I am not the decision maker who makes that happen. That would be you, because you guys are the ones who decide where you buy stuff from. Buying within North America is no longer a patriotic issue. It's an issue of economic stability for the next several decades. This is a good story. Okay, that's it for me. Do we have time for some Q&A? How do you want to do this? Okay, we'll do a little Q&A. Anybody?
Yeah, you talk much about India.
India.
With India's population exploding versus China, what's their role for U.S. agriculture?
Okay, what's the role for US agriculture in India? Now, obviously, there's not an animal protein story in India that's very big. What animal protein they need, they grow themselves. It's primarily zebu. But for plant agriculture, I think it has a really bright future. Now, the Indian population is doing the same thing that everyone else has done. It's aging very rapidly, much more rapidly than the Europeans did, actually. In the midterm, 10 to 30 years, this is a really good thing. Because if you have a lot of people aged 20 to 50 who don't have a lot of kids, they will buy more and better food because they have more income to spend on that. And that is the Indian story for the next generation. Now, you fast forward to 2050, 2060, that picture is going to change. I don't think a lot of us are overly worried about 2060 at this point. Is that fair? Okay. What we're going to be seeing in India is a massive industrial build-out because they have to do the same thing that we do. They need to increase their industrial supply system to supply themselves. They can't rely on the Chinese like they have to this point. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be part of an integrated system like we are. For us, the Mexican labor market is very complementary. India doesn't have a partner like that, and they don't want a partner like that. So it will all be domestically driven, which means it's going to have quality issues and they're not going to trade a lot. But if all they do is build enough manufactured goods for 1 billion people, that's still a pretty big growth story. And it's stable.
What about the excess Russian nat gas? Where's it going to go? Here right now it's getting upgraded in Korea. It's monitored in countries like Turkey or Romania.
Sure. The question is what happens to all the excess Russian natural gas? Is it just going to be processed into intermediate goods and laundered? Some of that can happen. The problem is there's a limit to what the Russians can do because their industrial plant is maxed out and largely maintained by foreigners. So there will be some incremental stuff like that in places like Turkey. Turkey's doing something similar with steel, actually. And some of the oil to this point that they've been able to export goes to India, and then the Indians repackage it, put a different name on it, and send it out as well. The problem is twofold. Number one, the industrial accidents are getting more and more common, and the Russians lack the technical acumen to do most of the repairs themselves. The second problem is that insurance question, because if it has to go by water, then you have to still get out of the country, and the reinsurance companies have already stepped back and said no policies at all. So that will happen on the margins, but overall we're looking at most of the baseline going offline. The question is timing. In the case of natural gas, there's a little bit less flexibility with oil because it's just harder to move. And as the Europeans are backing away, that's where 80% of the transport infrastructure goes. So anything that wants to be redirected has to get a new pipeline. You don't do that in a year. The last pipeline that the Russians built to China took 11 years. And that's with the Chinese doing most of the work. There's really not a good way to speed that up.